On December 16, 1773, dozens of Bostonians gathered together at Griffin's Wharf and dumped over 46 tons of tea into the harbor, sparking a series of events that would eventually lead to the War for American Independence. This story has been told as a local story of patriotic Bostonians and their rivals. It's been told as an imperial story of colonists versus British officials. It's been told as a national story of the beginnings of the American Revolution and the American nation. But we also need to tell a global story of the Boston Tea Party, as we can see in the first image, a German print that shows people of African American and Native American and European descent watching the Boston Tea Party unfold in the harbor. This is an imagined scene, but I still think that it shows the global flavor of the Tea Party and its importance and the type of people that the events of the Revolutionary era, the type of impact that these events were having on different peoples. So here's the way in which we can think of the Tea Party as a global event. You have the East India Company, which is becoming more and more of a territorial force in South Asia in the 1760s and 1770s. Their principal product, tea, is farmed in China and suddenly becomes popular among Europeans during the 1600s. It's mixed with sugar, which is farmed by principally by Afro-Caribbeans. When the Bostonians protest the East India Company, they dress as Native Americans. And this is an incident that also has a global resonance for hundreds of years afterwards. This is also something we can see in the second image, which was published in Paris in 1778. In this image, Father Time projects an image of an exploding teapot and shows the Revolutionary War with allegorical figures in the foreground representing America, Africa, Europe, and Asia, all looking on and watching these events unfold. In this image, an American army advances on the British army while a rattlesnake leaps from the teapot, and the rattlesnake itself was another symbol of America. Meanwhile, a French rooster fans the flames and stands atop a defeated British lion. So in many ways, the tea was seen as being at the root of a global conflict only 5 years later in 1778. So first, let's talk about the East India Company. The British East India Company and the American colonial governments were twins in a way. Both the East India Company and many of the American colonies and Caribbean colonies began in the early 17th century. And within what was then the English Empire, they basically were private ventures that became imperial governments only later. The East India Company was established as a monopoly on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. It was a way for a private venture, essentially, to pursue the national interest, the English national interest, at its own risk, at the expense, so as a way of kind of attempting to muscle out potential imperial rivals in Holland or in France. The downside of a monopoly, of course, is that it stifles competition. It allows one company too much leverage, both in the Indian Ocean and at home. And the East India Company is different from the American colonies in that the colonies never achieve that kind of leverage in Parliament, which is one of the things that's going to lead to conflict in 1773. Now, in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, the British Empire found itself responsible for new domains. If you looked across the globe, you would see Bengali weavers, Iroquois hunters, Irish peasants, Afro-Caribbean slaves, Boston shipwrights, Virginia planters, and Quebecois habitants, all of them finding themselves potentially under the authority of the British Empire. In the past, the different groups who had lived in the British Empire had relied on flexible arrangements with cooperative local leaders as a way of governing the empire. But after 1763, the British ministry became impatient with this level of flexibility and with this kind of loose connection to authority. And so the British Parliament tried to tighten control over its various colonial and imperial holdings, particularly over the East India Company and the American colonies. They sent imperial officials, many of whom were thought to be corrupt. They levied more taxes. They made it clear that the people of these colonies and companies needed to obey the central government in London. We know what effect this had and how this looked in the American colonies. This looked like the Proclamation of 1763 and the attendant troop presence. This looked like the Stamp Act of 1765, the Townshend Acts of 1768, the commissioners of the customs arriving in Boston in 1768, the Boston Massacre in 1770, and the Tea Act in 1773. So this is a story that's familiar to students of American history. But what did this tightening of imperial control look like for the East India Company? Well, around the 1760s, the East India Company was becoming particularly powerful in Bengal. They were collecting taxes, they were building up a military presence, they were striking new arrangements with local traders, they were encouraging certain kinds of cash crops, they were taking away power that local elites had previously held. And in addition to this, East India Company employees, many of them were so greedy and corrupt that people back home in England were starting to take notice. And right at this moment, in 1769 to 1770, a terrible famine hits the region of Bengal. And perhaps historians estimate today that perhaps 1.2 million people died during this famine. And to give you a little perspective, there were only about 2.5 million people in the American colonies at the time. And so this was the equivalent of wiping out half the white and black population of the 13 American colonies. So this was a horrible tragedy, and news of the horrible cruelties that were being perpetrated in India, in some cases by East India Company servants, but also as a result of this famine. These kinds of stories were kind of combining and making their way back to Great Britain and to the American colonies. Also at this time, the East India Company's financial picture is severely hurting. They were overextended in India even as the people were suffering, and a wave of bankruptcies tore through Britain and Europe in 1772. And so as a result, the East India Company finds itself in the midst of a financial crisis. And to save the company, the British Parliament focuses on the company's tea trade with China as a way of propping the company up and allowing it to get over its financial difficulties. The East India Company at the time was importing way more tea than people in Great Britain were drinking, partly because various smugglers were competing with the East India Company. This was illegal, but French, Danish companies would import tea to continental Europe, and then it would be smuggled into Great Britain, which was cutting into the British East India Company's ability to sell this tea to its customers. And so Parliament's solution for this in 1773 was, why don't we play the East India Company and the American colonies off one another? This isn't their intention, but this is sort of what's happening. So what they're going to do is they're going to allow the East India Company to unload its surplus tea on the American market. This would make tea cheaper for Americans, but it would also have three effects that the Americans really found objectionable. The first is that this was going to be an emblem of taxation without representation. There had been a tax on tea since the Townshend duties of 1768. It had never been taken off. And so if you're going to unload a bunch of tea on the American market, this is just reinforcing to the Americans that they still have to pay a tax on this tea, even though they had no voting rights in Parliament. The second effect is that the money from this tea, the revenue from this tea, was going to support certain civil officials, particularly in Massachusetts. And this was also something that the people of Massachusetts really found objectionable. And finally, this new ability for the East India Company to sell tea directly to America was extending the privileges of, let's remember, a monopoly company. And this was going to crowd out other British traders, American traders, in a way that the Americans, that was horrifying certain American merchants. And so when the Americans begin to be upset with the British government, they actually very briefly look to India. In a series of 5 pamphlets, a New York Son of Liberty named Hamden, who may have been Alexander McDougall, he painted a picture of the East India Company as an evil monopoly built on bribes. "Wonder not, then," he wrote, "that power thus obtained at the expense of the national commerce should be used for the most tyrannical and cruel purposes." He referred to the famine in Bengal that was in the process of killing 1.2 million people, and he called the East India Company lost to all the feelings of humanity, as they monopolized the absolute necessaries of life in India at a time of apprehended scarcity. He said, "The purchase of the company's iniquities, tea, must be sent to the colonies, He said, this is what's happening. The tea is being sent to the colonies, the profit of which is to support the tyranny of the East India Company in the East, enslave the West, by which he meant America, and prepare us fit victims for the exercise of that horrid inhumanity that they have practiced in the face of the sun on the helpless Asiatics. So in other words, all of the rapine and horrible corruption that the East India Company and the British Empire have committed in India, they are now going to bring this to America. That is what is so horrifying about the Tea Act of 1773, and that is the reason that Americans ought to protest it. A Newport newspaper chimed in, and it was disgusted that the company had probably shed more innocent blood over the previous 20 years. And in this newspaper piece, they estimated that they had slain as many as 3 million people than all the other world's wars combined. So again, the East India Company is seen as this monster that's being brought to the doors of the American colonies. John Dickinson, the lawyer who had become famous in 1768 for his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania against the British taxes, took up the pen name Rusticus and launched a similar attack on the East India Company. Their conduct in Asia for some years past has given ample proof how little they regard the laws of nations, the rights, liberties, or lives of men. He continued that they have, by the most unparalleled barbarities, extortions, and monopolies, stripped the miserable inhabitants of their property and reduced whole provinces to indigence and ruin. 1,500,000, 1.5 million, it is said, perished by famine in 1 year, not because the earth denied its fruits, but because this company and their servants engrossed all the necessaries of life and set them at so high a rate that the poor could not purchase them. Having denied Bengal of its wealth and corrupted it, he wrote, they now, it seems, cast their eyes on America as a new theater, whereon to exercise their talents of rapine, oppression, and cruelty. The monopoly of tea, I dare say, is but a small part of the plan that they have formed to strip us of our property. But thank God we are not sepoys nor Marathas, but British subjects who are born to liberty, who know its worth, and who prize it high. Most Americans, by saying these things, they're not looking to start a global revolution that would include Indians and Americans side by side overthrowing the British Empire. And as you can tell from these quotes, these American writers still had quite ethnocentric views of who deserved liberty and who didn't. But still, they saw India as a warning, and in response, they were going to dump this tea into the harbor at Boston to prevent this type of monster from coming to America's shores. And eventually, the resultant political conflict would erupt into bloodshed at Lexington in April 1775 and the 8-year war that followed. So having discussed the East India Company and why it struck the Americans so important, let's talk a little bit more about the commodity that they were selling and the commodity that the Bostonians would subsequently dump into the harbor, tea. And I want to talk specifically about the journey that tea takes from China to Europe to America, most of the way around the world. Why was tea so important to the Bostonians' protest? Was it just a symbol that they happened to pick up because Parliament charged a 3 penny per pound tax on it? Why did it strike the people of the time as being so significant? People would later say in the middle of the Revolution, oh, this little thing called tea has started this huge world war, and it struck people as so ironic at the time. But I think if we understand the mentality of the people of the 18th century towards tea, we may be able to make this seem a little bit clearer. Beginning in the 1580s, Europeans adopted 3 caffeinated drinks that basically they had never heard of before. One of them was chocolate, which came from Mexico. One of them was coffee, which came from Ethiopia and Yemen. And the other was tea, which came from China. None of these drinks were particularly palatable to Europeans. They didn't like the taste of any of them, even though the people in Mexico, Ethiopia, Yemen, and China, they liked chocolate, coffee, and tea just fine. But Europeans didn't really like the taste of any of them. They were a little bit bitter until they combined them with sugar. And so sugar is a topic we'll be getting to a little bit later. All the tea prepared for the global market at that time came from China. You could find tea in the foothills of India, but that stuff isn't making it to the coast and being sold around the world. The tea that people were drinking in Russia, in Persia, in Europe at the time, all of that came from China, where it was deeply embedded in the culture. It was carefully cultivated, processed, and then brought to Guangzhou or Canton, where European trading companies were allowed to purchase it, transport it wherever they wanted it, and sell it. In Britain, tea was initially a curiosity, and then it became an expensive luxury, sometimes used as a medicine, right? Now we think of tea as being so deeply embedded in British culture, but at first, it wasn't common enough for English people to have definite opinions about it or what it could be useful for. But by the 18th century, by the 1700s, it had become a major commodity. It was by far the most valuable import of the East India Company, which was importing 13 million pounds of the stuff in 1772. And the duties collected from tea that the British government collected accounted for 6% of Great Britain's national budget. So tea is important to the government, it's important to the economy, and it's becoming important to the culture. As the supply grew, as I mentioned before, this was partly because of the East India Company and partly because of smugglers, but as the supply grows, the price drops, and so more and more people in England and Scotland could afford to drink tea. Tea also becomes one of the many new imported goods that Americans were enjoying during the 18th century. During the 17th century, they couldn't necessarily afford as many English goods. All of a sudden, beginning in the 1740s, Americans can afford all sorts of stuff to import from England and Scotland, and tea is one of them. Tea becomes, even though Americans are enjoying lots of new imported luxury goods, tea becomes particularly savored in America, just as it was in Britain, because it was an exotic stimulant, it was a status symbol, and it was the focus of a feminine domestic ritual. So I'll draw your attention to the third image from 1764. This is called The Honeymooners. It was part of an English series of paintings about modern love. And you can see this young woman adding sugar to her husband's tea, right? So reinforcing this sense of them as a couple is the idea of the woman serving tea to her husband. Right? So in this way, tea at the time was thought to encourage family togetherness, it encouraged pleasant conversation, and it was a polite ritual that often fell under women's direction. Tea also, because it had caffeine, it encouraged productivity, and because you often drank it in fancy tea things made of ceramic and silver, it was a way that you showed your respectability. And so for these reasons, it was irresistible not just to wealthy people, but also to the middle class. But tea also created controversy, as we can see in the fourth image. This is an image called The Tea Table, and the caption underneath begins, "How we see scandal, for our sex too base, seat its dread empire in the female race." This verse, these poetic verses go on, and the author laments that destructive scandal circulates among women at tea, and so therefore tea was something that you needed to be wary of. So there are a few different reasons why tea was thought to be suspect. One is not everyone was sure it was healthy. Right? It's a new product. It seems foreign and strange. It's not something that your great-grandmother was drinking. So not everyone's sure that its physical health effects are going to be beneficial. There was a suggestion that maybe it might cause all sorts of digestive ailments and other types of ailments. Secondly, luxury goods in general, including tea, were thought to be troubling because they upended older, traditional, hereditary notions of who should be on top, who was superior, and who was inferior. Because goods are something that anyone with money can potentially afford to buy, all of a sudden you could be somebody from a completely lower class background but own all of the trappings of wealth, and this was thought to threaten the older order, the older social order. So that's another thing about luxury goods that make people nervous. And so if anyone can drink tea, then how do you determine who's better than anyone else, right? So this is another problem. The third is that paying too much attention to luxury, because these are worldly goods, this was thought to be sinful. And so you have many religious writers saying, well, no, we shouldn't be paying attention to these luxury things. We should be paying more attention to the state of our eternal souls. So that's another set of concerns. And finally, tea was thought to be worrisome because of what we see in this fourth image in the tea table. Women who gathered at the tea table who knows what they might do when they got together, right? It seems harmless to us, but women getting together without any supervision, who knows what might happen, right? They might tease, they might overspend on various goods having to do with tea. They might scold their husband in order to give them money to afford more tea things. They would be idle, they wouldn't be paying attention to their domestic duties, they might gossip, and they might cause scandal. So in other words, because tea might, so people were worried that tea might empower women and that it might feminize men, right, by drawing men into women's circle and women's sets of values. Now, today, all these critiques that I've just talked about seem snobbish, they seem suspicious, they seem misogynistic. And you can see this in a quote from a lawyer from England who was visiting Boston. He wrote, "The ladies here visit, drink tea, and indulge every little piece of gentility to the height of the mode, or to the height of fashion, and they neglect the affairs of their families with as good a grace as the finest ladies in London." So he's being sarcastic here, but this was a real concern, that tea was going to cause women to neglect their duties. It was going to draw men into this cycle of spending money on luxury goods, and it was just going to weaken society as a whole. And this was something that was really bothering people at the time. So even though tea is very desirable, it can make you more productive, it can make you more respectable, it's also something that's new and controversial, and it's something that's making people uneasy. So this is how the conversation went in Britain, and by extension, this conversation bled over into America. But in the American colonies, there was also a fifth concern, which is that luxury goods had all of these problems, and they threatened to make the colonies dependent on Great Britain. If America becomes addicted to tea, and caffeine obviously is actually addictive, but there was a thought that Americans were not just becoming addicted to tea, but all of the different fine goods that they imported to Great Britain. If they became dependent on getting this stuff from Great Britain, then Great Britain could use this as leverage to have more and more power over the colonies. It was bad enough that colonists had no power to vote, but if they also were economically under the thumb of the British metropolis, this was seen as something worrisome. And so that's one of the things that motivates the non-importation agreements that begin in 1768, this idea that, well, if we show Great Britain that we can get by on our own without British luxury goods, without tea, without fancy cloth and textiles from Great Britain, then that will force Great Britain to take us more seriously, and will force them to make more concessions to us and possibly lift the taxes that the Americans found so obnoxious. Now, obviously, during the controversy over whether Americans should engage in these non-importation agreements, whether to boycott tea and other goods, if you were going to do that successfully, women's participation was going to be crucial because women were important as consumers and were important as tea drinkers. And many women did engage in public boycotts of tea. So you can find them coming together and joining spinning circles to make homespun cloth and to kind of show their patriotism by engaging in public forms of boycotting and of non-importation. Now, this too creates controversy, right? Some women were attacked by patriots because they were said, oh, well, women are weak and they're not going to uphold the boycott because they're going to be too tempted, they're too subject to temptation. Other women were attacked by supporters of government, the people who are going to become loyalists, for participating in politics in the first place. Women have no business engaging in these public boycotts because they shouldn't be participating in public life at all. And so women find themselves attacked by both sides, but you can also find women defending themselves in print by saying that they did have a right to participate in public life in this way, and that patriotic women would brag that they were made of the stern stuff that would enable them to resist British goods if it meant saving their country and and making America safe for their posterity. But there are a number of interesting stories that you can see about women and their participation in these tea boycotts. Abigail Dwight, for instance, was the 48-year-old former headmistress of a boarding school for Mohawk girls in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and she was visiting Boston in June of 1769 during one of the non-importation agreements, and she wrote to tell her daughter that she was feeling ill because she had been drinking coffee in the afternoon at what she called a high liberty house. In other words, at someone's home where they supported the American colonists' non-importation agreement. So she couldn't drink tea, that was verboten, but she was drinking coffee instead, and it made her stomach hurt. And she said, not a drop of tea will one soul of them drink in Boston unless you were at the house of a government official, and then you could drink it. But interestingly, Abigail was unwilling to give up tea completely herself. At home, I may drink it, she said. So somehow, despite the fact that it was considered socially bad form to drink tea, you could drink it privately. You could get it somehow, and you could continue to drink tea. So this is one of the things that was happening. Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, remembered hearing that her grandmother, Dorothy, and her great-aunt, Martha Moore Ballard, were sipping tea in the cellar while her great-uncle was away, because he was a staunch supporter of the Patriots. And so it's interesting. Some of women's fondest memories of these non-importation agreements were these little family rebellions, right? Drinking tea while the men of the house were away. So what we can see is that some women joined men's vocal rebellion against the tea and showed their public spiritedness that way. But other women quietly used the tea boycotts as a platform to stage their own little rebellion against men's authority. So in spite of all these controversies, one thing to remember is that Americans in the 18th century loved drinking tea. They gave it up after 1773, not because of the Boston Tea Party and having a prejudice against tea, but because when their own avenues to China and Great Britain were cut off, they eventually turned to coffee, which could be grown in the Western Hemisphere in places like Jamaica and Brazil. And that's mostly the reason why America became more of a coffee-drinking country than a tea-drinking country, unlike Great Britain. So the next subject I want to talk about is sugar and slavery. You couldn't drink tea without sugar if you were an American or a Briton, and much of New England's economy was based on trade with the slave economy of the Caribbean, where sugar was grown. So we hear a lot about tea boycotts in the 1760s and 1770s. Was anyone at that time thinking about boycotting sugar as a way of protesting slavery? And for the most part, the answer is no, not until the 1790s. There had been some anti-slavery sentiment prior to the 1760s and 1770s. You can hear the anti-slavery sentiments from people like James Otis. But one thing that's interesting is that in the years 1772, 1773, all of a sudden a lot of anti-slavery voices pop up right around the time of the Tea Party. So for instance, in Great Britain, there was the famous Somerset case in 1772, which allowed a slave who was kind of suing to, his master had brought him to England, and he said, well, now that I'm in England, you don't have a right to hold me as a slave anymore, and the judge agreed. And the judge had given it a very narrow interpretation, but a lot of anti-slavery advocates jumped up and said, aha, this means that you can't actually hold a slave in England. That's fine for the Caribbean colonies and the American colonies, but you can't actually hold a slave in England. And if you bring one here and he runs away, you may not be able to sue and get that slave to return to you. So that's something that people who are interested in the slavery issue hear about and get very interested in. A man named James Swan, who we think was a participant in the Boston Tea Party, he wrote a pamphlet arguing against slavery in 1772. So it's interesting to think about him aboard these ships throwing tea into the harbor when he was also a staunch anti-slavery advocate as well. Harvard students discussed a ban on slavery, on the slave trade at commencement in 1773. The poet Phyllis Wheatley became a transatlantic sensation in 1773, so all of a sudden people are reading the words of an African-American poet. A number of black petitioners approached the Massachusetts legislature and asked them to end slavery in 1773. The House of Representatives actually does so, but it's vetoed by the governor. In the aftermath of the Tea Party, the town of Medfield spoke out in favor of the Tea Party, and they spoke not just about Parliament and its violations of the Massachusetts Charter and their complaints against the tea tax, but they also spoke out against slavery. So there were some people in Massachusetts who kind of combined these critiques together. And finally, another connection between the issue of slavery and the Tea Party is that the owners of one of the tea ships, the Dartmouth, were the Roach family, R-O-T-C-H. 2 generations of Roaches were active opponents of slavery. This was a New Bedford family that was also part of Nantucket. They were Quakers. They purchased indentures in order to free slaves. They convinced many Quakers to give up slaving. They paid for lawsuits on behalf of slaves who were seeking their freedom. Some historians claim that the Prince Boston case in which the Roach family was involved in the early 1770s effectively ended slavery on the island of Nantucket, just as the Somerset case ended slavery on the British Isles. And one thing that we can ask ourselves is that why the Roach family mostly dealt in whale oil rather than sugar? Did they have some sort of moral component to the trading sectors that they were involved in? And it's interesting to kind of ask ourselves, in the search for freedom in a world of tea and sugar, was it the Roaches rather than the American patriots who really had the right idea? So I think that's an interesting question. If anything, I argue in the book, the Boston Tea Party kills this nascent infant American anti-slavery movement by forcing everyone to focus on the coercive acts and the British, and by giving Massachusetts a lot of good reasons to be nice to Southern slaveholders, right? If you're shaking hands with these guys at the Continental Congress and you want their alliance against Great Britain in 1775, 1776, you're not going to be quacking loudly about let's get rid of slavery. You're going to have to kind of keep that conversation mum if you want that alliance to hold. So now slavery is eliminated in Massachusetts during the American Revolution, but quietly. There's no big announcement. There's no day of jubilee for the freed slaves. And so, so Massachusetts has to kind of quietly do away with slavery, and there isn't some big moment that might have created some sort of moral sea change in the United States. Later, in the 1850s, the Boston Vigilance Committee rescues a fugitive slave named Shadrach Minkins from the United States Marshals in 1851, who are trying to seize him and bring him back to the South. And after when this this happens like on the Boston waterfront, right, the same area where the Boston Tea Party had happened. And the famous anti-slavery activist Theodore Parker calls it the most noble deed done in Boston since the destruction of the tea in 1773. So only much later in the 1850s are people thinking about the anti-slavery movement and the Tea Party in the same terms. But in 1773 initially, the Tea Party itself has little to say about slavery. Now, the next topic I want to talk about is the Native American costumes. The destroyers of the tea dressed to look like Indians, and they pretended to imitate their speech. They gave a war whoop. The chiefs who were aboard these ships supposedly used an unintelligible mock Indian language, which was then relayed to the other men via an interpreter. And so there's this interesting Indian component to the Boston Tea Party, by which we mean Native American Indians. Now, the quality of these disguises varied. You can read a lot of different reports about what these disguises meant. These 18 chiefs supposedly had the most sophisticated disguises, while other people put together hasty disguises at the last minute. They might just wrap a blanket around themselves, and smudge a little soot on their faces or something, and say, "I'm an Indian now." Some of the people who joined at the last minute had even shabbier disguises or no disguises at all. But the blacksmith Joshua Wyeth, who participated in the Tea Party, he later said, "We surely resembled devils from the bottomless pit rather than men." So there was this idea that these guys were definitely disguised. So the first question we want to ask is, why a disguise? Well, obviously it must have been so no one would know who they were. But let's keep in mind that Boston only had about 16,000 people at the time. It was unlikely that the identities of these men were actually a secret. You knew how your cousin carried himself or how your neighbor walked, right? Even if it was dark and you couldn't quite see his face, you knew who all these guys were. There were maybe only about 100 of them. Only less than a quarter of these 16,000 people were adult men. So by process of elimination, you pretty much probably knew who these guys were. But let's keep in mind, a disguise is more than just a concealment. It also allows you to step outside your everyday life and rebel against conventional norms. And so in the past, right, Bostonians had dressed in disguises before. Rioters had dressed as women, as clergymen, in order to protest various things. So the idea of having a disguise of some sort, there was precedent for it. And even though we don't think that these disguises actually concealed, these disguises do make a statement that was very important. The disguises were possibly meant to be scary, but also because they were obviously disguises, they were also meant to reassure the community that the riot wouldn't get out of hand, right? Nobody actually thinks that nobody actually thought that these were actual Indians, right? It was supposed to evoke the scary idea of Indians raiding a ship and dumping a bunch of tea, but everyone could be like, oh yes, but they're not really Indians. And so this was a way of kind of saying, well, this is something that the community might actually approve of. The disguises were meant to protect the rioters' identity, not because it actually concealed who they were, but because it sent the message to the wider community not to tattle on them, right? I'm wearing this disguise, so you might know who I am, but you better not tell, because we don't want these guys to get prosecuted, because what they're doing is something that's reflective of what the entire town of Boston supposedly wants. Finally, it was important that these tea destroyers be seen not as part of the respectable gathering at the Old South Meeting House, where Bostonians had been debating what to do about the tea, but as something separate, right? So even though it's supposed to be something reflective of what the entire community wants, you want to be able to get away with a situation where the entire town can't be blamed for what these outsiders, what these Indians have done. So although it was true that in the past Bostonians had often blamed blacks or Irish or young boys for riots like the Boston Massacre, John Adams famously says this in his defense of the British soldiers during the trial after the Boston Massacre. And although it had been true that blacks and Irish and young boys had been part of these multiracial crowds in Boston, what the idea of a Native American disguise was not to actually blame Indians for what was happening, but as a way of protecting the town from blame, but making it clear that these Indians could have been anyone from the community of Boston. So why Mohawks specifically? Well, the New Englanders had taken the land from the Indians, of course. They had allied with Mohawks in the past during King Philip's War. Mohawks had raided white settlements at Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1704. So there had been a testy relationship, a relationship that had been filled with conflict over the years. The Mohawks had been allied with the Anglo-Americans once again during the French and Indian War. And after that war, the British were victorious, and the Mohawks, like the other Iroquois, suddenly had no way to counterbalance British power. They used to be able to play the French off of the British. Now, the British are the only game in town, and the Mohawks themselves said that they were worried about being made slaves to the British Empire. Nevertheless, the Mohawks were respected for their military prowess, and in a way they were even respected for their rejection of European attempts to assimilate them. So this is why Mohawk identity might have been very appealing to the Bostonians. Bostonians, as we might imagine, had a conflicted image of Indians. The fifth image is a picture of the weather vane that sat atop the Province House in Boston, where the governor was meant to reside and where he entertained audiences. So the official seal of Massachusetts also uses an Indian in its image. So the people of Massachusetts identified with Indians to some extent, right? But again, they had these conflicting views. They saw Indians on the one hand as savages that needed to be exterminated, as children that needed to be converted and brought into the fold of Christianity, as mischief makers who terrified Londoners, and later as a symbol of American resistance against Great Britain. The British themselves encouraged the idea of equating white Americans with Native Americans. And you can see this in the sixth image, which is a British cartoon about the Stamp Act, which portrays America as a kneeling supplement Indian, reeling from British policies. To the British, even those who were trying to argue in Americans' favor, the Americans were rude, possibly a little bit savage, and inferior. To them, the tea destroyers' disguises reflected Americans' true nature. White Americans, stung by this disrespect, felt that the best way to defend against such slurs was to appropriate Indian disguises for themselves. As the scholar Philip Deloria pointed out, the colonists envisioned themselves as new and improved Indians who deserved America for themselves. The New World would be purer and freer than the corruption and tyranny of old Europe. A white American in an Indian costume could envision himself as the American ideal, both civilized and free, the best of both worlds. What actual Indians at the time thought of this minstrel show is something that we can't know. But there had been Indian disguises and invocations of the Mohawks in defense of American rights before 1773. In the case of the Boston Tea Party, the idea of Mohawks probably came from New York City, actually. 3 days before the Boston Tea Party, a Boston newspaper reprinted a New York City notice that was signed The Mohawks that protested the Tea Act and said, "We are determined not to be enslaved by any power on earth," and promising an unwelcome visit if anyone tried to land the East India Company's tea. So they were deliberately having fun with Columbus's mistake from 1492. In a January 1774 satire, Edward Proctor, who we think was one of the tea destroyers, posed as the chief sachem of the Mohawks, and he wrote, "Tea is an Indian plant," because, an East India Company product, "and of right belongs to Indians of every land and tribe." Right? So playing off this idea of tea being an Indian product and then Indians being the one who came and dumped it over the side of the boat. So deliberately kind of confusing the different meanings of Indian from around the globe. So the final thing that I want to talk about is how the Tea Party lives on in the world's memory. The Tea Party's iconic significance has captured imaginations for over 2 centuries. It's inspired protesters from women's suffrage advocates to opponents of property tax hikes. It inspired anti-abolitionists in the 1830s and abolitionists, as we've seen, in the 1850s. It inspired temperance advocates in the 1850s and then anti-temperance forces in the 1920s, white supremacists in the early 20th century, and civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King, in the 1960s. Ever since the Tea Party, people have sometimes celebrated, but also sometimes debated and even distorted the memory of this event that helped to bring about the American Revolution. And the Tea Party turns out to have global resonance, too. Since almost no one was seriously hurt at the Tea Party, it appeals to advocates of a grand global tradition of nonviolent civil disobedience. When the British government in South Africa forced the Indian residents there to be registered and fingerprinted, Mahatma Gandhi led the local Indian community to burn their registration cards in 1908 in protest, and a Daily Mail correspondent later compared this action to the Boston Tea Party. When Sun Yat-sen of the Kuomintang threatened to seize customs revenues at Canton in late 1923, and the United States and other countries sent warships to intervene, he sent a cable to Americans 3 days after the anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, saying, "We must stop that money from going to Beijing to buy arms to kill us, just as your forefathers stopped taxation going to English coffers by throwing English tea into Boston Harbor." So in other words, the Tea Party has been claimed by people from a number of parts of the ideological spectrum, and despite these claims, it's important that we get this history correct. Thank you. Well, the East India Company had been given its position initially. The reason why you wanted to grant a monopoly to a company is the government itself didn't have the funds or the means or the political capital to do these things on their own. So if a bunch of merchants come to them and say, well, we'd like to explore trade with the East Indies, and since we're going to be putting in all the risk to do this, if we succeed, we'd like a monopoly on all future trade with this region, right? Because the whole thing could go pear-shaped and fall apart and collapse in their faces. If that happens, then the British government can kind of wash its hand of it and say, well, you tried. It wasn't us. It was a bunch of private merchants. And then if it succeeds, then it's going to pay off for that company forever. So in the 17th century, the English government said, all right, this seems like a fair bet to us. And so 170 years later, right, the East India Company is still a monopoly. It's become deeply imbricated with the British state in a number of ways. A number of members of Parliament were stockholders in the East India Company. The East India Company was probably the second most important financial institution in the British Isles after the Bank of England itself. And so if it were to collapse, large sectors of the British economy might collapse with it. So and obviously the East India Company had been a source of tax revenue for the British government. You didn't want that to just go away. It had been a source of wealth in a variety of other ways because of the economic and commercial profits that the company had generated. So really, the simplest way of explaining it is that by 1773, the British government believed that the East India Company was too big to fail. It couldn't, just as with the banks or the auto companies over the past few years, this was an instance where the British government really felt that it couldn't just allow the East India Company to collapse. It could try and tighten regulatory controls over the East India Company. It could say, well, you guys just can't be wild cowboys over in India anymore. We need to pull the reins in on you a little bit. But it couldn't just allow the entire thing to collapse. It was at that time the East India Company was thought to be too important. Over time, the East India Company will be made part of the British government. That is going to happen over the next few decades. But at that moment in 1773, the British government wasn't willing to completely absorb and nationalize the East India Company, but it also didn't feel able to let it collapse. The colonists believed that Parliament had no right to tax the American colonies because the American colonies didn't have any direct representation in Parliament. So this is what the phrase "no taxation without representation" means. It meant that if the American colonists have no right to vote for representatives in Parliament, then Parliament as a body had no right to tax, and some even thought that Parliament didn't have any right to legislate for the colonies either. Once the Americans make that decision, then it's not clear that the Americans belong in the British Empire at all. So not every American in 1773 was willing to go that far, but they're only a couple of years away from drawing that conclusion, right? The Americans voted for their own local legislature. Those guys, they voted for them. They were, elite white men at least were represented in those legislatures, and those local legislatures taxed the land and property of the American colonists. That struck them as fair. Parliament, sitting 3,000 miles away with no direct representation from America, maybe it was okay for Parliament to enact commercial legislation and say, well, no, you can't trade with the French during wartime. That struck them as a reasonable sort of law. But the idea that Parliament could directly say, you must give us 3 pennies for every pound of tea you import, that was something that struck the Americans as offensive, and it had struck them as offensive ever since the Stamp Act of 1765, which really would have been a very invasive tax on every legal document and newspaper and other printed material in the colonies. To them, the tea on tax, even if it was a small thing, even if one thing that I often remind people is that the Tea Act was going to make tea cheaper for Americans. It was actually going to have less of an impact on their pocketbook than you think. So it's not higher taxes and higher priced tea that the Americans are objecting to. It's actually just the principle, right? The idea that, well, all of a sudden we're being seduced into getting cheaper tea, and once we accept the idea that, oh, we'll pay the tax so the tea is still cheaper, once they're seduced into that mindset, then Parliament will say, okay, great, the floodgates are open, let's tax every single thing the Americans buy from Great Britain. And so that kind of slippery slope argument was the reason why people like Samuel Adams were really trying to hold the line and say, no, we have to insist on this principle of no taxation without representation, or there'll be no end to the types of taxes that Parliament will want to levy on us. So again, right, it's not the idea of taxes themselves. It's not even the idea of imported goods being more expensive that's worrisome to them. It's the principle and the slippery slope and the dangers that were around the corner that really concerned the Americans. And it was their relationship with the British government that was at stake. Yes, the news of the destruction of the tea immediately spreads beyond Boston. Actually, a number of Americans regarded it very skeptically. They were worried. Benjamin Franklin over in London, George Washington in Virginia, they're like, whoa, a riot ending in property destruction, that's not the kind of thing that the American resistance is supposed to be about. Franklin even urges the town of Boston to pay the East India Company back for the tea that was destroyed. And he later changes his mind, and people end up rallying around and saying that the Tea Party was, this patriotic event that was preliminary to the American Revolution. But at the time, not everyone celebrated it. Plenty of people did. There were plenty of towns in Massachusetts who were corresponding with the Boston Committee of Correspondence who said, right on, we don't advocate violence, we don't advocate property destruction, but sometimes your back is to the wall, and it's pay now or pay later, and we're not saying you did the right thing, but sometimes people are forced into this sort of thing, and that's what happened. So yeah, the news does spread far and wide, and as you can see from the graphic images, the first two graphic images, it's seen as being this kind of global event. So yeah, no, it's not a secret that American newspapers all corresponded with one another and reprinted each other's items, and so the news items that first appear in the Massachusetts papers, they make their way to other colonies. Actually, the Boston Tea Party takes place on December 16th. The news gets to Philadelphia just in time for Christmas, and so they issue a special edition that says a Christmas box, or in other words, a Christmas present for us, is that the Bostonians have stood with the other colonists and resisted the landing of the tea. So there are some patriotic Americans, the Sons of Liberty, who are very excited by the news as well, even though some people were also worried and skeptical about it. There's a famous cartoon that shows the ladies of Edenton, North Carolina, refusing to drink tea as part of the boycotts of 1774. And there was later a satirical British print showing this, which seems to kind of suggest that these ladies shouldn't have gotten together and made this declaration that they wouldn't drink tea, that this was inappropriate this was something inappropriate for women to do. So again, yes, during 1774, especially after the First Continental Congress meets in September of 1774, the idea of boycotting tea spreads all over the American continent. And so there are a number of what we might call tea parties. There actually are other instances of people destroying tea publicly that happen elsewhere in Massachusetts, that happen in New Jersey, that happen in New York, there's one in Maryland. And then there are also these meetings in which men and women, or just women, get together and say, we won't drink tea until the coercive acts are lifted, or until the Tea Act is lifted. This is a type of political protest. But because it's something as simple as something as familiar as tea drinking, it's something that women feel that they can participate in as well. But again, this was something that misogynists disapproved of, and so you see satires, both printed and visual, arguing against this practice. And the answer is it's both, and it depends on your perspective. Groups like the Earth Liberation Front have said, well, in the past, right, have said, well, we can blow up SUVs as a protest against climate change. Obviously this was thought to then be a criminal act. So the Tea Party in some ways might look like the same kind of thing. Yeah, nobody was hurt. Some people were hurt, but no one was killed as a result of this. But the equivalent of in today's dollars of between $1 and $2 million worth of property was destroyed. Is this the kind of behavior that we think people ought to be engaged in just because they don't like the laws? I don't think that that's something that we're always willing to accept. So I think that actually throughout American history, people have not only thought of it as a patriotic act. In fact, the first people to come forward about participating in the Boston Tea Party, as far as I can tell, don't really do so until 40 or 50 years later, when most of the men who had participated in the Tea Party were very old or dead. And so there's some evidence to suggest that some of the people who participated in the Boston Tea Party were kind of ashamed of what they had done, right? That this wasn't something to brag about, that this was something that they had done that was lawless, that was an act of property destruction. And because people in the 1820s and 1830s were still dressing up as Indians and rioting against local governments, it's not necessarily the type of behavior that Americans wanted to encourage. Now, look, the end result of it was the American Revolution, and that it has been a source of pride for Americans. But did the did the ends justify the means? That's something that Americans have actually been surprisingly ambivalent about, and they have not always been willing to kind of say, yes, the Boston Tea Party was an unalloyed act of heroism. It was something that all patriots ought to be willing to do in the name of liberty. I think that most people wouldn't be willing to follow that argument to its logical conclusion, although in American history there always have been people who have been willing to follow that argument to its logical conclusion. So I don't think there's a right answer to that question. What level of oppression would it take for that kind of act of vandalism to be seen as justified? I think that that's a question that people in various societies all over the world have asked themselves since the beginning of time.